A very good evening and a warm welcome to our episode on law and order. And today we are going to have a fruitful discussion on how the right to information is practically being used by the people of Sri Lanka and how the public authorities respond to the right to information and what challenges we have when we talk about right to information in Sri Lanka. So once again, we are happy to welcome to Sri Lanka Rupavahini Corporation premises Ms. Chamindri Saparamadu, attorney at law. She has worked to a great extent for the past few years on governance, transparency, and on the issues of right to information. So it's a great pleasure to have you here.
Thank you very much, Ihara, for inviting me.
And also, just a follow-up from our last program, right to information in Sri Lanka is, like I told in my introduction, is something new. We have not had legislation dealing with right to information before. So after almost 30 months since its enactment in Sri Lanka, how do you see the public using right to information in Sri Lanka, and how does the public view right to information?
Well, looking at the feedback that I have been getting and also the surveys that have so far been conducted, there seems to be a great amount of interest among the public on this new law. This is, of course, despite the fact that there are gaps in terms of awareness raising and so on. Now, in apart from all the what we hear directly from people, what we get to hear from the people, there are also the data that there is also this data that comes out from the annual reports that the public authorities submit to the RTI Commission, because every public authority is required to submit an annual report on RTI implementation to the RTI Commission. So far, in the year 2017 and 18, the first 2 years of full implementation, out of 1,800 public authorities, I mean state sector public authorities, only about 200 odd public authorities have submitted these annual reports. Based on the data in those annual reports, there have been about 5,000 odd RTI requests that have come into public authorities.
So that is for the period of two complete years.
Yeah, to about say 18 months.
18 months.
So that means that on an average, every public authority gets, say, I can say between 1 to 5 RTI requests per month, and that is, of course, depends on the information demands, because requirements, for example, certain sectors like the education sector and so on might be getting more information with regard to issues like school admissions and so on. So there could be other departments or government institutions which do not provide public services of that nature, and then there are no requirements, not great requirements. And most of the information requests have come from the Western province, and the least amount of requests have come from the North-Western province. And most of the requests have been channeled to government departments. And if the UNDP, for example, in 2018, that was last year, conducted a survey with 200 public authorities across Sri Lanka. We drew a sample of 200 public authorities out of the 1,800 public institutions, and the sample also included 400 information officers and designated officers. So the survey was based on questions on their perceptions and their experience in dealing with RTI law. And we found that most of the information requests have been on land and property related issues with regard to development projects and so on. And then, of course, the human resource issues, within organizations and so on. So definitely the interest seems to be increasing, but in every country, in the initial years of implementation, there isn't that amount of demand for RTI, because it takes a little bit of time for people to actually see the value of this law and also to learn about the process, because now in certain remote areas people may know that there is a law like this, but then they may not even know, they may not know how to submit RTI request, where they should submit this, to which organization should they direct this request to. So, I think it takes a bit of time to educate the people, and from what from my personal, my experience being involved in this RTI implementation process for the last 3 years, there have been several programs to educate the people, and also lot of RTI clinics where legal professionals and civil society, community based activists and all have helped the general public, particularly in vulnerable areas, to fill RTI requests and educating them, helping them, giving them that guidance on how to fill RTI request and where to direct them and so on. So, if you look back at 2007, February 2017, where we were just as the law was became operational in Sri Lanka, and where we are now, the level of awareness has really increased. And definitely the kind of information that is being requested by the public, by also litigants, the legal professionals, they certainly seem to be seeing a value in this law.
So, you gave an overview about RTI from the citizen's perspective. Let's look at it from the state's perspective. How does state institutions, government departments and authorities, how do they see RTI? Do they see it as a maybe a burden on their day-to-day work, or how do they view RTI in Sri Lanka?
I think it's kind of a mixed reaction, what I can say, and again I've been hearing very different versions. I also there have been couple of surveys done, and I will refer to them.
Oh, the correct question would be, what is their attitude towards it?
I mean, for example, if you go and ask a public information officer, the tendency is to say that the law is very good and so on. The only way that we can actually assess their level of interest is in how actually the law is looking at how the law is complied with. But several surveys have been done looking at the implementation, an assessment of the enforcement of the law, looking at trying to see what are the gaps in implementation. So, I want to say firstly that the law has a enormous transformational potential, effect, because this is a public sector that have so far worked in a kind of an environment where sharing of information was not the practice, right? So, there has to be a huge attitudinal change in the public sector. But having said that, now when the UNDP, for example, conducted this survey, what I referred to earlier in 2018, the methodology was that the questions were directly posed to the information officers to seek and assess their level of interest, and their attitude with regard to this law. So, interestingly, about 80% of the public officers interviewed they were positively disposed towards RTI. They understood the value of it. They saw the law as a very important legal right that the people have got, and they didn't consider this as an additional burden. But of course, a small percentage did say that this work comes in addition to their existing responsibilities. And so, there is some truth to it also, because when you talk about information officers, they are not new recruits. So, this is these are additional responsibilities that have been given to whoever who has been appointed as an information officer. So, in addition to doing their regular work, they have to also be involved in the RTI related responsibilities. And so, the attitude in that survey, for example, has been quite positive, but as I said, it was based on questions, assessment was based on questions posed to them, the information officers directly. But you can also assess the attitude of public officers towards this law through various other methods, independently assess their interests. Now, I like to refer to this assessment that was done by the Transparency International very recently, when they did this assessment of implementation with 30 public organizations, institutions. And so their assessment was based on actually looking at 3 areas, right, assessment areas. Firstly, they looked at what is called proactive disclosure, which is like the requirement in this law that all public authorities must voluntarily disclose information in certain areas, for example, with regard to their operations, organizational structure, the staff, the job descriptions, the functions and so on, the decision making process, the budgets and so on. And so this the assessment looked at proactive disclosure, and then they gave a score, right, for proactive disclosure, and the majority of institutions scored low in this area, with 18 out of 30 authorities scoring a red grade, meaning a scoring between 0 to 33. So, in this area the implementation has been not so great, because this is different to responding to RTI requests. This is a requirement that the public authorities need to regularly update their websites and disclose this information. Now, when I discuss some of the implementation challenges, I can outline as to why we see gaps in this area. But in assessment area 2, on the institutional measures taken to implement the RTI Act, like for example, appointing RTI officers, information officers, and then there is a requirement to disclose their details in a place or in a way that public can actually know who is the information officers, how to contact them and so on. The authorities score more favorably. So, most of the authorities out of 30 scored a green, a score between 67 and 100. And in assessment area 3, on processing of requests, RTI requests, then there are several stages of the RTI process that was looked at. For example, from provision of acknowledgement to responding timely to RTI request, and also the charging of fees and so on. Again, the overall score was not that great, because it had a red grade. At least 16 out of the 30 institutions came within the red, scoring a red grade, which means from 0 to 33. So, I mean, in the initial years of implementation, I think every country, the law was first RTI law was introduced first in Sweden, and then thereafter, even if you look at countries like India, it has taken at least 5 full years for the law to be implemented to a satisfactory level, because
and also for the organizations to familiarize themselves with it.
Yes. So, this is actually comes again to, I think, as you said, the implementation challenges, which I think we will discuss later. So, I think at best I can say it has been a mixed reaction, and of course, in the initial years of RTI in Sri Lanka, there was a bit of a euphoria about this law. The parliament passed the law, and then even among political parties, the state bureaucracy, there seems to be a lot of interest. I am unable to say whether the interest is waning in the public sector, but I'm not going to comment on that. But certainly, I think there seems to be interest, and it is, however, good to keep this interest and then keep the RTI agenda on track.
And also that brings us to I think it's a major question for today's discussion. What challenges do we have in RTI implementation in Sri Lanka? What factors holds back the implementation of RTI?
Well, actually, firstly, I think, as I said earlier, the law has a huge transformational,
So it will take time.
It takes time, and also Firstly, the readiness, the preparedness of public authorities, because the law was introduced, and then from a culture of being secretive about government information, now you move on to an environment where you have to share with people every information about how the government institutions and public authorities function, how the decisions are being made with regard to projects, recruitments and whatever, and how funds are dispersed. So firstly, I think in terms of the attitude, it takes time for public officials and public institutions to get used to this law, to internalize, that now it's a different environment, open government, where transparency is the criteria. And so there are also a lot of institutional infrastructure that has to be set in place, like for example appointment of information officers. They are not new recruits, so how do you sort out the division of responsibilities and so on. And then also this very big capacity development requirement across the public authorities across Sri Lanka. So that capacity building requirement, I think, is, and how you respond to that it was a challenge even now, because these information officers are normal general public servants who are in a transferable positions. So one officer can be information officer for a year and then transferred to a different organization. Then sometimes that knowledge is lost, and then the capacity building has to happen in a sustainable and a continuous manner. So that has been one of the greatest challenges, lack of knowledge and awareness about the duties and responsibilities under the Act. And then also, how do you interpret, for example, now as I said in the earlier program, how do you interpret the exceptions under Section 5, because there is always a discretion given to the information officers to decide when they receive an information request on whether to give information or not. And the only reasons why they could deny an information request is if it falls within any of those exceptions in Section 5 of the Act. So the capacity building requirement has been enormous. Then secondly, I think in most organizations the information has not been stored and preserved in a systematic manner. For example, some of the information is available in very technical language, so not simple language that the citizens can understand. And then also how the information is being consolidated, categorized, whether they are properly categorized and preserved, because sometimes you have them in files, and then when an information request comes, you have to go and look for the files to find out that information. And most of the information is also preserved in hard copy format, right? Not every information is digitized and maintained in digital form. But so the electronic formats are sometimes easier to disseminate and so on. So I think that has been one of the challenges. And so gradually I think public authorities will have to move towards digitization of information, which is a very expensive affair. Then thirdly, I think having some of the inconsistent laws. Now RTI, Section 4 of the RTI Act says that this law has overriding effect, So whether if it comes in conflict with any other written law, the provisions of the RTI Act prevails. But still again, a study that was done identified over 100 pieces of legislation which has inconsistent provisions, right? And we are yet to see how the courts would interpret these inconsistencies, and whether they would give precedence to the RTI provisions in the RTI Act. So in dealing with those inconsistencies, right, whether the government, the Sri Lanka needs to look at amending some of those inconsistent provisions and then make all the legislation compliant, consistent with the RTI legal regime. Then also the lack of public awareness on this law. Now that has also been one of the biggest challenges, because you have to have great demand for RTI, for the public authority to supply information. As I said earlier, the demand has been increasing, but the success of this law depends on how it is being used by the citizens, the media, the other professionals, and so on. So generating that public awareness also has been a bit of a challenge, because of certain constraints, resource constraints and all that, and it is going to take time. So these are the challenges that I see in the first few years of implementation.
And also that brings me to our final question. What do you see as necessary interventions when which are required when we talk about the implementation gaps of RTI?
I think
that's a very very open-ended question.
Yes, I think, I can just look at in terms of prioritizing. I think there are lots of interventions necessary, but definitely looking at a more systematic and continuous capacity building of public sector, so which requires institutionalizing RTI training. Now this can be done by for example, making RTI training mandatory in the public sector. I can now, there have been lot of training programs conducted in the last couple of years. There have been training of trainers. We just have to ensure that training happens in a systematic manner, so that even if an information officer is transferred out, the new one that comes does get that training.
So you speak about training within public authorities. Do you also agree with me if I propose that there should be at least a substantial level of knowledge about RTI given in schools and education institutions for the students?
Yes, definitely, because I wanted to touch on that under public education. Okay. Because so not every school child joins the public sector, but very specifically looking at the duty bearers, that is the public authorities. There is this need to institutionalize RTI training, and then also there needs to be a culture of how the government works, look at changes to that. So maybe looking at the establishment code and some of the practices in the public sector, and then to prioritize, right, RTI obligation responsibilities, and also to incentivize the public officials. Maybe also try to include, important to include RTI in the job descriptions, performance assessments and so on, so that RTI is taken very seriously. And then of course looking at the institution, the infrastructure, and how you preserve and how the public sector preserves and maintains information documents, and moving towards digitization incrementally, because it is a costly exercise, as I said earlier. We are talking about even the smallest Grama Niladhari division in rural areas, and how do you make those sophisticated, take those sophisticated methods to them. So I think that is something gradually that the public authorities have to move towards. And then also looking at some of the challenges for proactive information disclosure, because if you look at most of the websites of public institutions, you see them rather than being easily accessible information portals, they have lot of images and very colorful websites. So moving a little away from that and making them web portals that can be easily accessed by the public to obtain information. And so restructuring some of the institutional websites, and then also going beyond the web-based communication methods to look at some other types of communication strategies, because the internet penetration in Sri Lanka is not that high. So to be able to reach to the the rural areas, to people at the very ground level, and how you communicate. So to look at different communication strategies and so on. And then I'll come to that point about public education. It's very important, because I think as a society we need to have this transparency in governance and information sharing as a part of our social fabric, as values in our society. So in addition to specific RTI training, I think for the younger generation, school children and university students growing up to know that they have this very important right, and that it's a country that have open government, transparent government, and that they people can demand this, are entitled to access information that is held in by public authorities. So looking at school curriculums, looking at university educational programs, and then how you introduce RTI in them, so that you don't have to have very specific RTI training programs in the future, but people will invariably grow up knowing that there is this right.
So with that discussion, we would like to end today's program on law and order, and we are thankful on behalf of Sri Lanka Rupavahini Corporation to Ms. Chamindri Saparamadu, attorney at law, for taking time off your busy schedule for being here to share with us these important aspects of right to information in Sri Lanka. And certainly, with the hope of seeing you again next week, we wish you a very pleasant night.
Thank you.